So first, on the Mennonite, So first, on the Mennonite side of things, so I'm sorry, before I jump right into it. But first, before I dig into these discussion of commonalities and differences, I want to share a little bit about my context and why I care so much about these two traditions. Both are, by the way, traditions I did not grow up in. And so these are both traditions I chose as an adult. So first of all, on the Mennonite side of things, I've had a connection with this congregation since 2003, almost 20 years. The first time I visited was in 2003, back when I was in law school, and I was still preaching at the Church of Christ I grew up at. And the person who invited me to come was Sadie Mast. I first met her at a peace protest in Oklahoma City over at the Gold Dome corner. We were both standing side by side with our protest signs, and we had a great conversation. And bear in mind, at this point in time, this was early in the Iraq War. It was a time when there was a lot of tension, and it was very hard to be a peace person. And bear in mind, I was also preaching at a Church of Christ at that moment. Not a comfortable place to be in. So talking to Sadie, it was so refreshing. And by the end of the conversation, we'd had this great conversation. She invited me to come to Joy and actually to be a guest speaker at Joy. So I said, sure, because you can't say no to Sadie.
I really spoke the first time.
I was a guest speaker my first time here. I was a Church of Christ preacher coming as a guest speaker, which was, and if I remember right, I even presumed to speak on peace issues because it was all the stuff I wanted to preach at the Church of Christ. I couldn't preach, so I shared it here, and we were very like-minded, to say the least. And I had a wonderful experience when I visited here, so much so that I was pretty much ready to quit the Church of Christ right then. But Sadie discouraged it. She said, no, James, you should grow where you're planted. And so I tried, but that just lasted a few more months. And finally, they fired me. I think the main reason was I wasn't evangelistic enough, but the other reason they didn't say, but I'm pretty sure is there, was I was talking too much about peace in my sermons. That doesn't fly in the Church of Christ. And so at that point, I told Sadie, I tried, but couldn't do it. So I started coming to Joy after that, and I actually joined the congregation officially on Easter Sunday, 2004. During my last year of law school, and this picture, by the way, is one of our board meetings for what would later be called the Center for Conscience and Action. But you can see several folks that are really dear to us. My friend Rena on the right. In the center is Fanny Bates. Over on the left-hand side is Phyllis Byerly from the Quaker community, and of course, Moses and Sadie and me. A lot of meetings we had for this project. But anyway, this project started during my last year of law school. And Joy, because of this, enabled me to do some peace organizing work that focused on helping members of the military get discharged, as well as to challenge some of the mistreatment that folks experienced while in the service. Doing this work under the auspices of Joy was a tremendous opportunity. In fact, eventually Joy named me as the Minister of Peace and Justice. And it brought me in contact with a whole cohort of older experienced activists who had been doing spiritually rooted peace work for many, many years, including Catholics, Unitarians, and many other fellow travelers. But Joy was not just my church, and it wasn't just my hub of activist organizing. It also gave me a home, quite literally. I think I first lived upstairs over there. Later, I lived in a garage apartment. Then later, I lived back over here. Then was back in the. I think I moved at least a couple times back and forth different parts of this building. It was a good place to be, a great, great home, and especially during some really challenging times in my life, to have it as a home. So my first 5 years as an attorney were challenging, but also good ones. The congregation grew in numbers, especially with a new surge of young adults who were busy deconstructing their evangelical conservative upbringings, but also seeking to find new ways to follow Jesus. And we did a lot of good work together, had a lot of fun, and built some strong friendships. And we were blessed to have many elders come alongside us to work in this work. And I just chose, there's so many pictures I could have chosen, but I just chose a few. One, this is Susan Lee, who's over on the left side at one of the early protests. Moses here speaking at one of the spiritual walks of peace in the center. And then I have Phyllis Byerly. And this is just the picture from her memorial program. But one thing I was thinking about Phyllis this morning that some of y'all don't know is that in my work with military people, we often needed psychological evaluations done. Phyllis, because she was a retired psychologist, wrote many of them. It helped some folks to get a much better outcome than they would have had. And she did this, at that time, she was at least in her 80s. And so really extraordinary, even at this stage of life, that she continued to be of service. We also, though, along the way, we faced challenges and times of conflict too. But through it all, this congregation, its people, taught me a great deal about what it means to seek the way of peace and justice in the context of spiritual community. But by 2011, my personal life was getting messy. I was hitting a wall of burnout in my activist lawyering, but was also reconnecting with Becky, who I'd known from back in high school years, who I would end up marrying at the end of the year. And I was looking, I found a picture of us at our wedding. I was looking for one. Moses is one of the officiants for our service. And so I was trying to find a picture of Moses too. I couldn't find it this morning in time, but that's our wedding picture out at Romano State Park. And so marrying at age 35 brought a lot of changes for me. One is I became a dad. Getting to be one of Ty's dads became a really big part of my life. But it also brought another piece of the story, and that is Judaism. Because in her first year of marriage, Becky came out to me, not about issues of orientation, but rather about religious orientation, because she said that she was secretly interested and compelled by Jewish spiritual practices and had been so for some time. She came to this place not because of her background, she wasn't born Jewish, but rather because she found that the spiritual practices she had inherited from her Christian upbringing did not work when she was in time of crisis. And particularly for her, it was dealing with cancer and a divorce, all while being a new mother. Having all that hit all at the same time was a lot. And her faith tradition didn't really help her much. It was pray harder. There came a point that didn't work. But she had some experiences at this time that pointed her towards Judaism as having spiritual practices that would be meaningful. But she also was in a context where she couldn't really explore those things in a real way. So as we were building a new family and a new household, we really, by the time that she ended up telling her whole story, I was like, yes, we should explore this more. And by the way, if anyone's ever interested, she wrote about this much more in a really powerful way for Kveler.com, a Jewish family living magazine, about this story, about how she came to adopting these practices. So that became a big part of our life. And we as a family, what we started doing was that we started doing Jewish spiritual practices in our home context while still remaining part of our respective church communities. This evolution evolved over the years and became more and more important to us. And to make a very long story short, we as a family reached a place where we felt it was time for us to commit to Jewish community in a more tangible way. And these pictures here I chose are just ones of kind of some of our early years of exploring and of really delving in more deeper into Jewish practices, but also Jewish culture, as you can see from the Jews in Space exhibit we saw at the Tulsa Jewish Art Museum. By the way, if you've never been, it's worth going. Called the Sherwin-Miller Museum of Art. It's a phenomenal museum. They now have a new ring added to it now on Holocaust education that's really well done. It's worth the trip. In Tulsa. So there's some pictures of Ty with some of the holidays. And of course, Ty and Becky love to bake. So of course, baking became a big thing. Also in these last few pictures, you can tell this is during the pandemic, as you can see, we're watching our services on Zoom here while eating a meal. So, and this is also, I kind of like this picture because it shows on the right, because it shows Ty as he's growing in his engagement and whatnot. So these are, by the way, this is Ty on the right-hand side. That's Ty's pride-colored challah bread, which was really cool. People, we actually we baked it and brought it to temple. Folks loved it. So anyway, though, this desire to be more committed in a tangible way, coupled with my desire to break out of some congregational conflict we were dealing at the time, led me to step down as one of the ministers of this congregation. Today, I see myself as a Jew, but as one that has been shaped in deep and profound ways by the radical community of Jesus followers here at Joy Mennonite, as well as by the broader movements of humanistic spirituality. So this is the perspective I'm bringing to this conversation. And I say all this because I think context is important. I think that what we bring to the conversation is important. So I wanted you to know I'm coming at this from the standpoint of being, rather, I might describe myself as being an enthusiastic fan of these two traditions. That's the perspective I'm coming with. And so that brings us to the heart of today's message, which is 4 points of commonality I'd like to explore today. The first one is that I believe both traditions share an ethic that focuses more on the earth in the present rather than focusing on the afterlife. 2, I believe that both traditions have a strong focus on social justice. 3, both traditions have an experience of diaspora. And 4, both traditions have a practice of reading and interpreting sacred texts in the context of community. Before I go on, though, I want to make it clear that we're doing a big picture, 30,000 feet up in the air kind of approach to this, because the movements of Judaism and Anabaptism are too huge, too diverse. It's really hard to say anything definitively about these movements as a whole. So what I'm going to talk about today, when I talk about Judaism says this, Anabaptism says this, I'm really saying that these movements, these traditions have a tendency of saying this. A tendency of saying that. Not all Jews will agree with even these 4 points. Not all Anabaptists will either. But I am saying that as a whole, these traditions tend to point in this direction. I also want to make one more kind of disclaimer kind of thing, and this is say that when I talk about Judaism today, I'm specifically talking about Judaism in the 21st century. I'm not talking about the Judaism of the Bible. And that's an important thing because a lot has happened in the last 2,000 plus years. And the Abrahamic religious family tree has evolved and changed. Christianity has, Islam has, Judaism has. These 3 traditions have morphed, have changed. And so talking about looking to the Bible to tell you what Jews do today makes about as much sense as looking at the Bible to say what Christians do today. There's inspiration, sure. There's lessons to be learned, yes. But we do different things than they did back then, both Jews and Christians. So, for our first point of commonality, that is that these 2 traditions share a present tense earth-centered ethic. By the way, I will just mention in passing, I initially was going to frame this as being orthopraxy, right practice, and comparing to orthodoxy, right belief. But I got some really good input from folks online on this question. And I realized that those words have too much baggage. There's too much other things attached to them. So I'm instead not using the terms, instead really focusing on just the idea of the present and of the earth. And so first, looking at Judaism, about the idea of Jewish ideas on the afterlife. Well, here's the reality. If you get out any Bible, and if you look through what would be in a Christian Bible, but the Old Testament, what Jewish Bibles would be the Bible, you'll notice that there's almost nothing on the subject of the afterlife, very little, if at all. In fact, the references to the afterlife in the Hebrew scriptures are kind of fuzzy, pretty unclear. And that has, and in the earliest of days, there's really not much of a sense of, in fact, I picked this picture online showing this pathway of 2 paths, the way it's always framed growing up. You can choose heaven, you can choose hell. Well, this concept is really pretty alien to early Jewish tradition. Later on, though, Jews did start to engage with the ideas of heaven and hell, particularly around the 2nd century BCE in the context of the Maccabean revolt and the context of trying to establish political autonomy again and having varying degrees of success with this. Many people, and not just them, the neighbors as well, started having these ideas of heaven and hell as a way to say that life sucks here on planet right now, but God will fix it later. God will, it's a deferment of justice, but this idea at times became popular. But then and now, there's never been consensus in Judaism about the idea of the afterlife. In fact, today, the Pew Research people say that the majority of Jews in the United States today do not believe in the concepts of heaven and hell. That, to me, is a pretty important statement. So what about the Anabaptist tradition? Well, many Anabaptists do hold some degree of traditional Christian views about heaven and hell. Not all do. There are many many Anabaptists who do not. But even for those who do believe in the traditional conceptualization of heaven and hell, it is not an aspect of the faith that ends up being emphasized. This means that most Anabaptists do not spend a great deal of time speaking about heaven as being the goal for Christian living, but rather speak about the values of the kingdom of God in the present. And by the way, this picture is a famous picture from a Quaker painter, I believe 1800s maybe, but his depiction of what he thought the kingdom of God might be, the lion laying down its lamb and whatnot. What I appreciate about the Anabaptist perspective is it is quite different than the orientation of much of Christianity, certainly of evangelical Christianity. I also think that the emphasis of both Judaism and the Anabaptist traditions on the present, I think, frees us from, I think, one of the most dangerous aspects of the other worldview, which is this deferment of justice, of saying to tell people who are oppressed, don't rise up, don't push back, don't ask questions, don't ask why am I poor, don't do that, because it'll all be made better in heaven. The old saying, pie in the sky, by and by. That was unfortunately the message that many people hear from faith. But I appreciate the fact that from the Anabaptist side and from the Jewish side, that is not the message. The message instead is life here can be better. Which that also takes us to our next point, and that is the point of social justice. Both traditions share a deep focus on social justice. For Jews, this is rooted in a concept called tikkun olam, which means to repair the world. So to do tikkun olam is to be engaged in practical acts to fix the world. This includes all the ways the world is broken, environmental destruction, care of the earth itself, but also mending broken and fractured human relationships. This value of tikkun olam goes back to the earliest parts of Jewish scripture, but was especially amplified through the writings of the prophets who called the people of Israel to recommit to righteous, ethical living. And also in the more modern times, since at least the 1960s, this idea of tikkun olam has energized and animated a whole new generation of activists for social justice in Judaism. So for the Anabaptist side of the equation, and again, this is probably not the best pic, it's a white Jesus picture, but I was trying to find some picture of Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount. For Anabaptists, the focus on social justice primarily comes from their reliance on Jesus's teachings on the kingdom of God, a coming reality that we manifested not only in eternity, but especially in the present world. And by the way, unlike Luther, who saw the Sermon on the Mount as an impossibly discouraging burden, and he literally said something quite almost along these lines, it's impossible, it's discouraging. Anabaptists read the same thing and saw hope. Because Anabaptists read the Sermon on the Mount not as an impossible chore, but rather as an actionable manifesto of ethical living. It is a sort of canon within the canon. In other words, a central text that's so important that helps to inform all other interpretation of Scripture. By the way, speaking of the passion of these two traditions as it relates to social justice, I'm reminded of two bits of good advice on this topic. One is from a Jewish voice from long ago. One is from an Anabaptist voice of much more recent vintage. So the first one is from, The first one is from Rabbi Tarfon, and he was a rabbi who worked somewhere between 70 and 135 CE, very early on. But he was quoted as saying, "It is not your responsibility to finish the work, but neither are you free to neglect it." But then I'm also thinking about something that Sadie has told me many, many times over the years, that she often said, do what you can do, but not too much. For me, taking these two quotes together, what I'm hearing is, and these two great teachers, is that the reality is the struggle for justice is long, and that we have to keep the work sustainable, to go the distance. We don't know when the journey's over. We don't know when we've reached the finish line, but we have to stay in the struggle. And what I appreciate about what both Rabbi Tarfon from 2,000 years ago and what Sadie said a few years ago was that We have to keep moving forward. We have to keep working for and doing what we can, and not too much. The third point of commonality is the experience of diaspora. And I would argue that the experience of diaspora is one of the is for especially for Judaism, but I think to some extent for Anabaptism as well, has been the fuel that has led to transformation and evolution. On the Jewish side of the equation, I think it's fair to say that what we call Judaism today is really at its heart a religion of diaspora, because it was in diaspora that Jews fully embraced the idea of God as a portable deity. In other words, in the ancient world, they largely thought that a God was in one place. The gods didn't move around. The Israelite idea of God, rather particularly, came during diaspora was we have a God who goes, you can't confine God. This was a major theological development, but maybe even the bigger development came from the primary mode of religion. What I mean by is what mode of religion, I'm talking about what do you do? In the ancient times, what did Jews, and before that the Israelites, what did they do? They primarily sacrificed animals. That was the focus of the religion. But diaspora took that all away. There was no more temple. It was rebuilt for a short while, didn't last long. And after, when the second time it was destroyed, there was no going back. And this was a radical change. What happened to replace animal sacrifice was worship and prayer. That prayer was seen now as the sacrifice we give to God rather than animal sacrifice. In fact, this change was so profound, I'm reminded of something that our rabbi at Temple B'nai Israel said recently in one of her messages. She said, if they ever bring back animal sacrifice, that's when I'm out. We all laugh, but the reality is 99% of Jews around the world, including the Orthodox, would agree with her. That's how big the break was. There's no going back. Animal sacrifice, it's in the Jewish tradition, it's understood as an evolutionary process. Once we sacrificed animals, now we don't need to. This was a tremendous reinvention. Now, at the same time, I don't want to paint too glossy, too rosy of a picture here. Diaspora is not easy. Maintaining religious and cultural identity in a foreign land requires a great deal of thoughtful education and the maintenance of markers of cultural identity, as well as arguably in a Jewish context, especially the preservation of language skills. And yet, arguably doing these things has made Judaism what it is today. Anabaptists also know diaspora very well. Anabaptists have been on the move since the earliest days of the movement, choosing to leave the homes of their birth rather than to give up their core values or to have to use violence to defend themselves. If the choice was killing others or fleeing, they fled. And like the Jews, Anabaptists have had to work hard to maintain their religious and cultural identity in foreign lands. Some have taken a very strict approach by using cultural markers like clothing, language, and food as dividing lines. But many others, and again, I'm thinking about the progressive side of the Mennonite world, have found positive ways to live out their Anabaptist values and enjoy the unique aspects of the culture while also being a part of the modern world. And I picked this picture from the MCC Relief Cell in particular because I think it's a good picture of, if you go to the MCC Relief Cell, you'll see Amish people there. You'll see progressive Mennonites there. You'll see other kinds of people there. Everyone is there enjoying often cultural foods with deep meaning and resonance. People enjoy the singing. People enjoy buying stuff. People especially enjoy supporting MCC. All these people have different ways of living out their Anabaptism and living out the cultural aspects. Something I don't think Anabaptists, I think are always as comfortable about talking about culture as maybe they should be. But culture is a part of what keeps the people together. Events like the MCC Relief Cell are a big part of that. And food is a huge part of it, huge part of it. So our fourth point of commonality is the practice of reading and interpreting sacred texts in the context of community. Now, the Anabaptist tradition has long embraced a community hermeneutic. That is, a hermeneutic, by the way, is just the way we read a scripture or a text, any text. What's our methodology for it? Anabaptists have long had the approach of doing it in community and in doing it in a way that tries to amplify all voices. And so that the least learned, the most privileged, the least privileged, everyone has a voice, everyone is heard. And that's why, to me, the Anabaptism at 500 project and the study Bible thing is so powerful. The idea that ordinary folks, even in Oklahoma City, can contribute to this is just an extraordinary thing. Now, the Jewish tradition also believes in community hermeneutics, but it looks a little different. And I picked, by the way, this picture. This is from a Jewish study Bible to kind of give you an idea of how Jews might read scripture. In the Jewish tradition, the idea is very similar, that you read scripture, you discuss it in community. But the difference is there's added the input of time. In other words, the emphasis is on commentaries. And so, for instance, in this one here, you're having the text in Hebrew, you're having an interlineal translation English below. But then you have, I believe this is probably Rashi's commentary in Hebrew. I believe this is another commentary here. And then there's a commentary in English. So you have three different commentaries going on this page of text. And even in the commentary in English, down here it says the Midrash notes yada yada yada, and here it says Rabbi Yosef such and such says. So it's this idea of bringing in all these other conversation partners, people from the past. Now, the one thing that's important, though, in the Jewish tradition is the idea that the past gets a voice, the past does not get a veto, meaning that we are free to read the text for ourselves and come to our own conclusions. We need to hear the voices of the past. We don't have to agree with them. And that's an important element. So these 4 points of commonality, I think, are pretty significant. But we also have some points of difference. There's many points of difference, a lot more than we'll have time to talk about today. But I want to talk about just 2 of them today. And by the way, I picked these 2 because these are insights, these 2 perspectives, I think are ways, I'm hoping that Anabaptists can see things to learn from, but I also would say for my Jewish friends the exact same thing. I think there's things we can learn from each other on these 2 topics. So the first one is the issue of nationalism. Judaism is quite different in Anabaptism in this aspect, because Judaism is rooted in a national or tribal identity, one that at times in human history has been represented by actual governments. That includes the early tribes of the Hebrews and the Israelites, which, by the way, was probably much more informal than we think of a government today. But nonetheless, there was some level of structure. We also later have the United Kingdom of Saul and David. We then have the later twin kingdoms of Israel and Judah. We have that brief period of autonomy that came after the Maccabean revolt. And most recently, we have the founding of the modern state of Israel in 1948. Today, about half of the world's Jews live in Israel, Palestine, and about half live in diaspora. While many of us in diaspora have complicated and, to be frank, sometimes even antagonistic relationships with the state of Israel, it is always part of the equation, if for no other reason than about half of the world's Jews live in the land. But for me personally, I'll say the complicated issue of nationalism is the hardest aspect of being Jewish. It's the thing I wrestle with the most. The Anabaptist approach has instead held out the ideal of anti-nationalism and of calling its people to a higher loyalty than state power. That's a sentiment that I find pretty compelling. But I will also say these ideals are not easy to live out, and that there have been very different approaches taken by different Anabaptists along these lines. For instance, you have communities who seek to be quiet in the land, who seek to stay out of everyone's affairs, mind your own business, don't get involved in the government, but also not try to change it. We have more progressive people who say, yes, the government is flawed and problematic, but we're going to fix the government. We're going to use the democratic voice in them. There are others who say, yes, I'll participate, but there are lines that I have to draw. There are lines that we have to be aware of. And so there are different ways of expressing, but nonetheless, within the Anabaptist perspective is the idea that the nation state does not reign supreme. And I really appreciate this aspect of the Anabaptist tradition in particular. And I'm glad that Anabaptists keep bringing this issue to the table. The second point of difference, I think is pretty profound, is that we have very different ways in which we engage in dialogue. Both Jews and Anabaptists have a high value they place on community. and hence both traditions seek to practice conversation and dialogue, but they differ in how they do this. Anabaptists tend, and I emphasize the word tend, to focus on gentleness and in finding consensus as being the most important value in these conversations. Jews, on the other hand, tend to focus more on disagreement, to be frank, and even purposeful argument. The best example of this might be found in the Talmud, the central text of rabbinic Judaism, written from around 200 to 500 CE, which provides detailed accounts of the arguments of the rabbis on various topics, with there normally not being an editorial voice to say which rabbi was right and which one was wrong. This is because all of the voices, even those in disagreement, count. This different conversational style takes a while to get used to. And I have to admit, when I first engaged the community, there are times I got my feelings hurt. Pretty often, actually. But I now think I prefer it today. Because in a Jewish context, if someone disagrees with you, they likely will tell you right away. People are more blunt. And I think from a standpoint of nonviolent communication, there is some value to this. So taken as a whole, I hope today what we've explored, these points of commonality, these points of difference, what I'm hoping is I'm hoping you see a little better why I've been drawn to these two traditions, why I love these traditions a great deal. I also think that there's value in there being different traditions. My goal is not to tell all Mennonites you should become Jews or all Jews you should become Mennonites or merging them. No, that's not what I'm at now. What I am saying is that these are two movements that have a lot of points of commonality. We should be in conversation more, and I think some good things could come from that. And I think we would have some real benefits if we were able to do so. So I think probably that's a good place to move us into our conversation time. So,
James, do you want to hang out there, or do you want to?
I can hang out here. It's fine.
Okay. So I guess we'll open it up to conversation. I would love to start.
Yeah.
So I guess it's only been like 8 or 9 years since I really become here. Wondering about this and more about this is. I heard the term cradleman, and I didn't quite know what that was. That is. It was always interesting to me in the United States that you had enclaves of Anabaptists, both Mennonites and Amish, part of Kansas, Indiana, Pennsylvania, and they kind of meet together. And I always wondered if that had to do with the diaspora story of kind of running from persecution in some ways, like you kind of trust your in-group. We also have Jewish communities that tend to kind of mold together as well in specific areas. I always thought maybe there was something common about maybe I never thought it was like an ethnic thing. I thought it was more like a historical thing. Like you have a hard time historically trusting others might be easier to hang together, if that makes sense. So I always thought it was interesting that Anabaptists always kind of like congregated areas together. Are there any commonalities to that, or do you think those are two?
I think there are, but I'm curious, Ralph or Moses, what do you think as far as why do Mennonites and Amish tend to settle in places together? I mean, I'll give you my theory, but again, I think others might know better on this. My theory is that these are traditions that emphasize community. You do things in community, and so the idea of living by yourself away from anyone else of your community, it becomes impossible to maintain your faith. In fact, the dialogue, I remember one thing I've heard in Mennonite side of things, that part of the reason when the VS houses were started and the choice to locate them in cities, I mean, they could have located the VS houses in rural areas and just did work in rural contexts. They didn't. And my understanding, part of the reason was they were concerned that Mennonite young people in this time period were moving to the big cities for work or marriage. And when they did, they tended to drift away from the Mennonite because there weren't Mennonite churches in those cities, and they would end up assimilating completely. And so the concern was, the thought was that by putting the VS houses in the urban areas, one was meeting needs that were there, but probably the bigger issue was that they were hoping that could be the seed of churches in urban areas. And if those churches were there, the young people would join them. Now that tended to actually, others can correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding is that in many ways wasn't successful. The cradle Mennonites who came to the big cities continued to leave. What did happen was, like what happened here was, we got a bunch of new people. The Mennonites grew from people who weren't cradle Mennonites. So Flip side of that, though, is that I do think cultural communities depend on cultural elements, and I do think Judaism has talked about this a lot more. The idea of cultural Jews is much more accepted, and or people that like come to services once or twice a year, pay their temple dues, but they see that as I'm supporting the community, but that's all my commitment is. You don't see that as much in an Anabaptist context, but there are some exceptions. Canadian Mennonite magazine ran an article a few years ago about a guy who said that I grew up Mennonite, I left it as an adult, but I now identify culturally as a Mennonite. And so he said, I enjoy Mennonite foods, I enjoy peace work, I think it's important. I'm not compelled by the religious stuff. And I think in Canada, I mean, it was also, I remember one time I went to Canada during my when I was really doing a lot more activism than I am now. And I remember the Canadian border guards, for various reasons, were suspicious of me. They were not going to let me in that day. And one of the things that they did not believe I was really a Mennonite. And they argued, but for them, it was they had in their head that Mennonites look a certain way and they saw it as an ethnicity. And so for me to say I'm from Oklahoma and I'm a Mennonite, and no, my parents weren't Mennonite, they just didn't believe me. I couldn't speak German. Canadian border guards, they were just not buying it. They were on the grumpy side of the bed that day. But, so I know that'd be my theory, but I don't know. Great question. Mm-hmm. So I'll give you the abbreviated answer.
Right. So if you could like layer on top of the Judaism and Anabaptism stuff. What do you mean by that?
Okay, humanism, the very short version of this, that's actually was very much tied to the Jewish part for me, because when I wanted, back up a little bit, one of my dear and complicated friends, Stephen Warner, has actually played a big role in me becoming officially Jewish, because early on in our explorations of Jewish stuff, Stephen at some point told me that I was culturally misappropriating Judaism. That troubled me a lot. I later learned that that's not exactly an accurate description of what we were doing, because the short answer is that traditions have things that have practices that are only for their members and have other practices that are available for outsiders. All traditions do this, the varying rules and degrees. But the stuff we were doing in Judaism, we were not doing things that would be, Jewish people would not be offended, for instance, if a non-Jewish person has a Shabbat dinner, those kind of practices. Nonetheless, Stefan's question did concern me, and I wondered, well, am I taking what I like out of a tradition and using it, but not giving anything back? Can I really be part of this tradition if I'm not part of the community? So I decided I wanted to convert. This was in 2014, when I was still on staff here. And the problem was that every branch of Judaism I looked into the question of conversion said you had to in some way renounce your old religious tradition. Was not wanting to do that until I found the Society for Humanistic Judaism. And their perspective was that conversion to Judaism is primarily an issue of culture. And so they have no problem at all with people who are bi-religious, who want to do more than one religion. And so I converted through them. And at the time, I started then delving because of that, but also I started delving more into humanism itself. And my understanding of humanism is it's a philosophy that says basically, I guess I would say that is largely agnostic about the idea of God. There are humanists who describe themselves as atheists. I think most would say they're agnostics. Some would even say they're theists, actually. But the issue of a humanist is someone who says our responsibility to make things better is here. We're not depending on God to fix our problems. And so if God exists, doesn't exist, irrelevant question. The issue is the world is broken and we can do something about it. And so that'd be my definition of humanism, probably other definitions, but really to me, it's about human empowerment. And so one of the controversial things in the humanist world is that more and more people are saying, I like the idea of human responsibility for ethics, but I also still appreciate some aspects of religion, most notably the idea of awe and wonder. And so more and more people are playing with the idea of religious humanism. And so the Society of Humanistic Judaism, they've done that in a Jewish direction. There's other groups who have as well, but Anyway, that's the short answer is, and for myself, I would describe myself these days as being intellectually agnostic, intuitively pantheistic. What I mean by that is intellectually, I can't prove or disprove God exists with just my mind. Intuitively, in other words, a hunch, I think there is something, but I'm not sure that something is something that we can divide into this is God and these are people and this is creation. I think it's a lot more blurry than that. But I can't prove any of that intellectually. So that's why it's an intuition, it's a hunch, but can't prove it, So I don't know, there's times I miss the certainty of the past, but in other ways, I think this is at least more honest and where I'm at. So.
Show a picture of the Jewish text.
Mhm.
The question would be, in general, I think take the commentary more seriously.
Very much so. Yeah, very much so. There's really, I'll give you another example. Many churches that I grew up with would talk about daily Bible readers. They'd even we'd have on a thing on the wall that would show attendance last Sunday, offering last Sunday, number of daily Bible readers in the previous week. You would never, ever see that in a Jewish context. It's not to say that reading Bible isn't important, but it's that there's really an emphasis on reading it together and discussing it together to such an extent that they would not emphasize individual study in the same. But if they do, they emphasize study as the key word. One thing in the Jewish context is this belief that study itself is a mitzvah, is a fulfilling of a commandment. And arguably, it's maybe the most important of the commandments. For instance, I'll give you one example. One of the Jewish festivals is actually tradition to stay up all night long studying Torah. But when they say study, they're not just meaning reading it. They're not just even reading commentaries. They're reading other things. They're bringing other things into the conversation. And it might be a very free-ranging thing, but it's this idea of engagement. There's also in the Jewish tradition, more traditional context, this idea of kavruta. A kavruta is like this soul friend, this deep friend, but someone you read the Bible with or read other texts with and you argue with them. They're more like your arguing partner, or sparring partner, if you think about like in the martial arts world. It's kind of that context. And so it's, yeah.
That dialogue that talk about it like that way, it's sparring. Sounds like the goal isn't winning, the goal is the conversation.
Yes.
No one's trying to, at the end, have their argument prevail. It's just like that's part of the process.
Yeah, I mean, it actually reminds me a lot of lawyering. Lawyers can be very polite and nice to each other before and after the hearing. But when we go to court, we throw it all out there in the courtroom. But a good lawyer then leaves it in the courtroom. You don't carry whatever challenging arguments you made, no matter what emotions might have been done in courtroom. When you're done, you're supposed to be back to being civil and nice. It's like almost like in a container, almost the argument.
They do that in Parliament.
Oh yeah.
They'll get real feisty.
Yeah, that's actually very Jewish, that approach. Now, I'll also say it doesn't always work like this. We're talking about ideals here. There's plenty of Jewish communities that are afraid to talk about certain things, that are not good at diet. I'm not trying to say all Jews. It's more of it's, I would say as a whole, this is something they emphasize, and but it's not. They don't always do it perfectly.
Yeah.
Just like Mennonites don't always do peacemaking perfectly, but it's still in the DNA. It's what we aspire to.
I do have another question. I'm just fascinated by most of I study religion, but really is mostly Christianity. I haven't really gotten into Judaism. The tenets kind of like these kind of core things through both Reform and Orthodox Judaism, or
Yes, but in different ways. I'll give you one example. I think one of the points was, well, I think I guess actually ethics would be a great example, or practice of things. What the Orthodox you might say in Judaism, there's a split between what's called halakhically minded Jews and non-halakhically minded Jews. Halakhic means tradition and law. And so there are Jews who focus, and this would be mostly the Orthodox, who say that tradition, well, it would actually say literally that when God got went to Mount Sinai, received Torah, came down from the mountain, he didn't just bring back the 10 Commandments, or even the ideas that God told him that he later said to the people, but he also brought back an oral tradition, the oral Torah. And so he shared that with Joshua, and those got shared. And so the idea is that throughout the millennia now, this oral Torah, this tradition, until the time of the Talmud, which is around 200 to 500 CE, when in this context of diaspora and this fear that we're losing it all, they started writing it down. And this happened some in what's now Israel, but quite a bit in Babylon, actually, in what's now Iraq, was where really the bulk of the Talmud got written down. And so then they started writing it down. And so today, halakhically minded Jews are going to say, what does the Torah say? What does Talmud say? What does all these sources say? And then they're going to look for the tradition as the answer. Non-halakhically minded Jews, and that's going to be Reform, it's going to be the humanistic Jews. To some extent, it'll be the conservatives who are kind of in the middle between the Orthodox and Reform. These folks would say the idea of mitzvah, a commandment or teaching, they hold to a little bit looser. So they would say, for instance, that yes, we can look at tradition to help us, but at the end of the day, not all mitzvahs are made alike. Some are even bad, and we shouldn't do them. So, for instance, a good example of a topic of controversy in the liberal circles is circumcision. Most Jews still circumcise their young boys. Not all do. Some are saying, no, hell no, we're not. This is a barbaric ritual, and why are we still doing this? And they're basing it on principles. They're basing it on underlying principles. And so the difference would be the more liberal versions of Judaism. But it's not the so another example would be kosher rules. The three synagogues in Oklahoma City all have three very different policies on that. Chabad, which is an Orthodox community, they're strict by the book, everything exacting to the rules. Emmanuel Synagogue, which is a conservative synagogue, they are completely kosher in the building. They follow all the rules to the letter. You can't bring in any food that's not kosher or hasn't come from a kosher certified restaurant or caterer. But most of their members do not do kosher outside their home, while the Orthodox would. The Reformed community, there the rule is we don't care. A few people do kosher on their own. Most people do not. Inside the building, the rule is don't bring in pork or shellfish, and that's it. So all the other rules, like mixing meat and cheese, not a problem inside the building. Bringing food from home that wasn't fixed in a certified kosher kitchen, not a problem. Having any silliness about having to have separate pots and pans for meat and cheese dishes like the Orthodox would have. The Reform doesn't do that. So the Reform temple, they're still more in the building is more traditional than most of the members are, but it's seen as, okay, what are the things people would really be emotional about? And that is eating pork and eating shellfish. So we don't do those in the building, but each of those three communities have taken a different answer to that question. And yet all three are engaging with the same fundamental underlying tradition, but they're using a different framework to sort out what they do. So. But what's interesting is here's what's not, that's a pretty unanimous across the board. For instance, the ideas about heaven and hell, that's pretty, I mean, are there Orthodox people that believe in those concepts? Yes, but probably even they are maybe not a majority. Another thing is belief in God is not a universal thing in Judaism at all, even among the Orthodox. I know of several Orthodox people who regularly go to an Orthodox synagogue who do not believe in God, but participate fully because that's their tradition and they see value in it. So
they don't have a preoccupation.
Correct. It's more, I mean, I was talking, Becky helped me a lot on this message, by the way, if y'all hadn't guessed, but one thing she said was that, you know, when Jews talk about the afterlife, it's more this esoteric, interesting thing we talk about, but it's not something that we do because we're afraid of anything. Like I remember I know of, for instance, conversations at the temple and some people say, you know, we ask them what they think, they believe in reincarnation. Other people would say, I believe in heaven and hell and all that. And others like, I have no idea. And all those people on the same roof, and that's not a dividing line.
So if you're not gonna evangelize, that's not the thing. But they're not out there.
Correct. Yeah. That, but also, I mean, there's also a tradition in Judaism going back to about the 1st century that Jews didn't evangelize, quit to evangelize. But prior to that, they did. Remember, Jesus in one of the Gospels, talks about, he was critiquing the Pharisees and said, you cross over land and sea to win back one convert, and then they become twice the son of the devil that you are. Something along, I may have misquoted that. So in those days, Judaism was a proselytizing religion, but that changed. And a lot of it was the aftermath of the revolutions, aftermath of the destruction of the temple. Jews found, and that they came to the conclusion that proselytizing was dangerous. And also, again, there wasn't this worry about heaven and hell at all either. That was part of it. So that became, and to such an extent for a long time, it almost, I would argue, went too far the other way, almost hostility towards the idea of converts for a long time. That's not the way it is now, but there's still vestiges of it in some places.
All right, officially the new. Sorry, I dominated that. We should just chat sometime.
Yeah. Oh, anytime. I enjoy it.
Okay, let's move on to joys and concerns. Give thanks be to God and Lord, hear a prayer.